Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome to the New Yankee Workshop, where we continue to bring you programs from the past we think you'd enjoy seeing again. Today we look at a project called the Garden Gate, and it's a good one. I built this gate almost 10 years ago, and it's still keeping out intruders, welcoming guests, and providing support for a variety of roses we've tried to grow over the years. I'm most pleased with the way the wood has endured. We bought it at the local home center as economical pressure-treated southern yellow pine, which can look pretty rough after a few years exposed raw to sun and rain. When I built this, we didn't have much experience with painting pressure-treated, and I worried it might not hold paint very well over time. Not so, it looks fine. That's an important concern with a formal design like this, where a painted surface is important. I'm also delighted with the way this heavy segmented arch, which we cut with a circle cutting jig on our bandsaw and spliced together with modern adhesives, has stood the test of time. A friend of mine who's a gardener says that you can't have a good garden without a fence and a good gate. So if you want to see how to build one, that's next, right here on the New Yankee Workshop. When it came time to design our gateway, we were very lucky. We have some good friends who design and build custom gates and fences. Now, when I was looking through their catalog, this one caught my eye, so they sent me out to take a look at it. It's an arched gateway with a trellis on the top. Now, it's a double gate, and they build all their gates out of eastern white cedar because it's so durable. Now, if you look at this top arch, you can see a joint right here. They've actually taken pieces of wood and lapped them over one another and then cut the arch out. This is a method that I've used before. The design is nice because the arch, or the radius of the arch, comes down right into the top of the gate itself. And a nice detail is that instead of bringing it to a point, they've added this decorative element, which really gives the post a nice look. Unfortunately, this gateway is much too large for the place we're thinking about, but perhaps I can scale it down a little bit, and instead of having a double gate, make just a single gate. I guess I'll get my pad and take some notes. All right, I confess, I got a head start on this project. I didn't want to have to wait for some glue joints to dry. So yesterday before I left, I took 4 pieces of 4x6 and glued them together in segments. And this will eventually form the arch which frames the gate. Now the techniques are interesting. Screwing on blocks so that I can clamp the joints together, and some splines. But you haven't missed a thing, because I still have to make another curved piece, which will actually be the top of the gate itself. Now, if you'd like a measured drawing of our garden gate, that'll be available with the materials list, and you'll hear more about that before the program ends. I'm building our garden gate out of pressure-treated lumber. This is #1 grade that I picked up at my local lumber yard. And I've built several projects in the past with this material, and it holds up really well. Now, the gate itself is going to be a little thinner than the frame that it sits in. So the first thing I want to do is take these pieces of 4x6 and plane them down to 2 3/4 of an inch thick. That's good. Now, before we use any shop tools, let's take a moment to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. And of course, hearing protection when necessary. Now, what I want to do here is take these 4x6s and remove an equal amount of material off of each face until I get to that 2 3/4. With the pieces planed to the correct thickness, I'm now ready to cut the ends to form the blank. Whenever you divide a circle into 8 segments, the cut will be made at 22.5 degrees. So I've turned my radial arm to 22.5 degrees, and I'll cut the ends of each piece. When I work with this pressure-treated material, I either wear a dust mask or I use good dust collection, because the sawdust is not healthy to breathe. Glue on the end grain of these joints would never be sufficient to hold the pieces together. So I'm making grooves that will receive some splines made out of the same material, making sure that the grain goes across the joint. And when these are all glued in, it'll never come apart. So I've set up my dado head cutter for a 1/2 inch width, a 1/2 inch from the fence, and 3/4 of an inch depth. We'll run each side of each piece. In preparation for gluing these pieces together, the first step is to add these clamping blocks along the top edge. Just some pieces of plywood with a couple screws. The next block to install is the pivot block. And when I made these cuts, they were at 21.5 degrees, 1 degree less than the cuts made at the joint. I'm going to attach it to only one side at this point. I center it under the joint, and the effect is that it will be tight at the bottom, but open at the top. And you'll see what that is for in a moment. The glue that I'm using is a moisture-cured glue. It actually cures in the presence of moisture. It's a perfect glue for an outdoor project. I just spread it on one side of the joint with a brush, and I'll moisten the spline and slip it all together. Now for the spline, I'll just dampen it with a sponge. Slip it in the joint. Now I just slip the pieces together, bringing the bottom of the joint snug, and attach the other side of the pivot block. Okay, now for a clamp. I just slip it over the top on each side of the clamping blocks, and then just pull the joint together. Now as I tighten the clamp, you'll see that the joint comes together at the bottom first, at the pivot point, and then as I pull it together, the whole joint gets nice and tight. This is a little trick that I learned from a master woodworker, Kevin Leip. Okay, well, I'll set this piece aside to dry, because I won't need it till tomorrow at the earliest. Above the arch, there's a beam which will support a trellis. I purchased a 6x6, and I think that's too large in scale, so I want to reduce it to a 5x5. The best way to start that process is to resaw the beam using my bandsaw with the wide 3-inch resaw blade. Cuts through it with no trouble at all. Well, now we'll pass it through the planer to sweeten it up. Above the beam, there will be a series of short rafters for the trellis, and I want to make notches at each location, so I've set up my stacked dado head cutter in the radial arm and adjusted the height for a 1/2 inch depth of cut. It'll take a couple passes for each one. Here's the next operation on the beam. The posts that support the beam will be connected by a mortise and tenon joint. I'm cutting the mortise in the beam using a 1 1/4 inch Forstner bit. I'll rough it out, and then I'll finish it up with a nice sharp chisel. While the dado head is still in the radial arm, I've taken some 2x6s, ripped them down to 4.5 inches in height to make the rafters which will sit on top of the beam. I want to make a corresponding notch in the bottom of each rafter to meet the beam. So I've ganged them together, and we'll just run them through. At the end of each rafter and at the ends of the beam, I want to make a decorative cut. So I've made a template out of a piece of plywood. We'll cut the rafters over at the bandsaw. With the same pattern, I'm laying out the end of the beam. And in the perfect world, I'd like to take it over to the bandsaw, but it's too long. Instead, I'm going to use my handheld jigsaw, which will go halfway through, so I'll have to make a cut from each side. I'll stay strong on the cut, and I'll sand it smooth later. Here's an 1.5 by 1.5 piece of pressure treated, which will be one of the lattice pieces on top of the rafters. I've set up a couple blocks as a fence, and I'm using a 2-inch Forstner bit to make a decorative cut on the end. To ease the edges of all the elements I've made so far, I'm turning to my router, which is equipped with a 1/4 inch rounding over bit. To assemble the pieces, I'm using a little bit of marine adhesive. It'll help hold everything together. Set the piece in place. And then I'm going to pre-drill for a couple screws. I'm going to drill down at an angle. Put one screw on each side. For screws, I'm using 3-inch long exterior grade screws. Here, the lattice pieces are attached using the same techniques. A little bit of marine adhesive and some screws. All right, well now let's make the posts which will support this trellis. The only thing that I have to do to each post is form a tenon at the top. So I've set up a stop block which will control the length of the tenon, and since I still have the radial arm set up with the stacked dado head cutter, I'll just plow out all 4 sides. Here I'm preparing the blank that I've made for the arch to cut out the actual curve. I'm attaching a 2x4 to the bottom of the blank with some 3-inch screws. And this will act as a pivot point on a jig that I've made for the bandsaw. Now here's my circle cutting jig at the bandsaw. Nothing more than a piece of plywood with a center line that's perpendicular to the saw blade. You can see several holes that I've used on other projects for all different radius dimensions. Now I've taken the blank and added another piece of 2x4 right in the center so that I could create my pivot point for a 1/4 inch dowel. Here's the hole that I want to use for the radius. I'm just going to drop the pin into the hole and just steadily push the piece through the saw, cutting the outside diameter. Okay, well that takes care of the outside diameter. Okay, now I'm ready to cut the inside radius. So we're going to move to a new hole, drop the dowel pin right in, and start the cut. Now you might have noticed that I'm cutting through my board, which actually forms my pivot point. But before I go all the way through, now that the blade is past the back, I'm going to patch it with a piece of plywood, and then I'll be able to complete the inside radius. Okay, and that takes care of the inside diameter. Well, good morning. I got started today spending some time at my oscillating spindle sander to remove the bandsaw marks from the arch. The next thing I want to do is ease the corners just as I did with the other parts. These biscuit slots will help align the arch with the posts eventually. And here are the corresponding biscuit slots in the posts. What I'm doing here is getting ready to bolt 2 posts together. This long post with the tenon at the top will be to support the trellis. This post that's a bit shorter will be the one that supports the arch. I'm just bolting them together with some 6-inch lag screws. Well, now you can start seeing the gateway take shape. I've installed a piece of strapping down at the bottom to keep both posts parallel. I've taken some diagonal measurements, and now I'm installing diagonal braces to hold it in position while I glue it up. With a little bit of marine adhesive on the top of the post and the biscuits in the arch. Let's see if we can squeeze it together. I'm not concerned with putting adhesive on the biscuits themselves. They're there just for alignment. Okay, that's good. A little more marine sealant on the tops of the post, and I can install the trellis. Now with a couple clamps, I can pull the joint tightly together, and then I'll peg it. A 1/2-inch brad point bit is all I need to make the hole, and then just a piece of hardwood dowel for the peg. What we have here is one lag screw which secures the arch to the trellis. Hugh, Norm, got 5 minutes? Good, come on over. Boy, it's a good thing I got a neighbor that works nights. All right, Hugh. Well, we're placing our new gateway at the corner of the vegetable garden. So I dug a couple holes down about 30 inches, and wouldn't you know it, there'd be a rock there, so I had to notch the inside post to go around it. All right, Hugh, let's see if we can drop it in those holes. Boy, this thing is heavy. Pretty good. Hey, that's going to look great. All right, Hugh. Suppose you want to get back to sleep. I can take it from I can take it from here.
Okay.
Now to fill in around the posts, I used some gravel and some sand, and the last couple inches will just be some topsoil. And when I finish that, we'll take a couple measurements and start to build the gate. Well, now I'm ready to start forming the arch for the top of the gate. And I'm going to have to use a different jig than I did for the arch and the gateway. In the gateway, I started with a semicircle blank so I could put a cleat along the bottom. This only has 3 segments, and I have no place to attach the cleat. So instead, I'm going to use a piece of plywood. I've drilled a pivot point here and put 2 perpendicular lines, brought the perpendicular line to the center of the blank, and now I'm just attaching it with some screws. Then we'll cut it out at the bandsaw. Okay, now we'll do the inside radius. Okay, success. Now it's back to the drum sander. Now I'm starting to work on the other pieces which will frame the gate itself. I took 4x4 material and reduced it down to 2 3/4 inches square. The piece that I'm working on now is one of the vertical pieces at the edge of the gate. I've laid out a mortise where the curved section will come in, and there's also another mortise down at the other end for the bottom rail. I'm using my hollow chisel mortiser to remove the material, set up with a 1/2-inch chisel and a drill bit. Drill bit does most of the work, the chisel squares it up. Here I'm beginning to form the tenons on the bottom rail of the gate. I'm using the same methods as I used on the post, my dado head cutter and a stop block. Now I'm ready to start forming the tenons on the top rail, or the curved rail of the gate. I've laid out each tenon, it's this area. First I'm going to cut the top of the tenon, then the end of the tenon, then a cut for the bottom of the tenon. Now I'm ready to make the cheek cuts for the tenons. And I'm just going to use the radial arm with the stacked dado head cutter. Now I should be able to complete the tenon with one more cut at the bandsaw. Now I've done a dry fit of all the pieces of the gate I've made so far to check the fit of the mortise and tenons, and they are fine. I've taken another piece of square stock and laid out to make half laps, which will go through the bottom rail and the curved rail for a center post. I've also laid out the decorative cut at each side of the gate, and we'll start by cutting that on the bandsaw. And that's how the top is formed. The radial arm is great for making the half laps that are straight, but it still doesn't do curves. So I'm using a chisel to hand fit this half lap for the curve section. Here I'm making some mortises in the bottom rail, which will receive the spindles of the gate. Where the spindles meet the curved upper rail, I'm going to plow out a groove the same width as the spindle size. To do that, I've set up my router table with a rabbiting bit. It'll take a couple passes and we'll get it complete. Once again, the radial arm with the dado head cutter makes forming the tenons on the spindles easy. For the last few minutes, I've been fitting each of the spindles. And now that this is the last one fitted, I can glue this up and put it in the clamps overnight. Hardware and final fitting is not far away. Well, the hardware for the gate couldn't be simpler. I've actually recycled the hinges from the gate that used to be here. In the gate itself is a lag screw with this round section and a hole in it. In the post, another lag screw with the corresponding hinge pin. I've pre-drilled holes for each bolt, and I'm just using a piece of pipe to spin it in. The latch hardware requires a 1-inch hole for the spindle. Our gate latch comes to us from a foundry in England, in the tiny village of Cradley Heath, where the company has been in business for over 150 years. They make all kinds of gate hardware like this twisted ring latch, which really gives our gate the finishing touch. Now there's one more thing I want to talk about, and that's the cross brace that I put on the inside of the gate. It's just let into the corners, nailed to the spindles, and let into the center post. This brace, along with the stout hinges, will really keep the gate from sagging. It's going to be here for a long time. Next time, a complete change of pace. We'll build a couple wooden trays. They could be used as serving trays or as display pieces. Now this antique pine one we found in a shop down in Nantucket, and the shop's owner seems to think it might have been used to feed poultry. I'll build one of these out of some antique pine, and then we'll build this one, which is a reproduction of another one we found. Made out of cherry, we'll even fabricate the bits of brass hardware. That's next time right here on the New Yankee Workshop.